I do, Madam President. Thank you.
Please proceed.
I want to start by associating myself with the remarks of my very well-spoken colleague, Senator Kissel. Obviously, this is a very difficult issue to speak about, and even more difficult to speak out in opposition to. However, I feel compelled to do so. I think that this is questionable public policy, and despite the circumstances that led to it, I believe it deserves the same scrutiny as anything else we do, and possibly even more so. Being here all the way back after the tragedy in Sandy Hook gives me some perspective and reminds me that it is not a good idea to make public policy based on an emotional response to a tragedy. It is much more important that we get these things right. Like everyone else, I am saddened by the terrible tragedy and the loss of Ethan Song. I cannot imagine the pain that his family is feeling, and I completely understand their desire to achieve some kind of justice and to do something in his memory. But I have concerns about what the actual bill language says. In truth, it makes very minor changes to what is an already existing law. And that should give us some pause, because the existing law was clearly ineffective in preventing what occurs. And I don't know why anyone would think that the minor changes that we're making in the law with this bill would achieve a different result. And outside of being able to say that we did something here, I don't know what the end game is as far as public policy in trying to prevent a further tragedy. Are we trying to change the law in a way to capture the circumstances that occurred in Ethan's case, to make that homeowner a criminal? I think it's important that people understand exactly what happened. I have scoured the news reports. I've read the police report. Some things we don't know, but what we do know is that the firearm was stored in a closet in the master bedroom. The gun was unloaded, it had a trigger lock, and it was in a cardboard box inside a Tupperware container. The ammunition was separate, but also contained in a cardboard box, presumably in the same closet. Apparently, Ethan was friendly with that homeowner's child, and together they went into the parents' master bedroom, into the closet, and discovered this firearm. Some say that might have happened at a previous time, and he was aware of where that was. But either way, that's the situation. And as a result, a horrible, horrible tragedy occurred. I want to just talk about the language in the bill so we understand exactly what it says. It starts by saying that no person shall store a loaded or unloaded firearm in premises that are under their control. This is a pretty broad term, and it raises some concerns for me, because it doesn't just necessarily apply to the person who owns that home, but I can think of a number of other circumstances where someone might be in control of someone's home. Even a babysitter who is taking the place of control of the home from someone's parents when they go out for a Saturday night date or something like that could potentially be caught up in control of someone's home. Even a realtor showing a property. I'm a real estate agent, and generally speaking, I try and keep my clients with me and be respectful of someone's home when I'm showing that property. But that's not always possible, especially when there might be young children around and you're trying to keep them corralled. Further, it goes on to say that the firearm must be kept in a securely locked box or other container. It doesn't say what a securely locked box is. It doesn't say that the box must be made of metal. It does not say that it must be secure enough that someone could not break into it with the skills and household implements that might be available to a teenager. It just says a securely locked box. Does that mean a toolbox? Does it mean a jewelry box? Does it mean, more appropriately, a safe? And why bother even indicating that it has to be a securely locked box if it is still acceptable in this language to store it in an other container? What could an other container be? If you go on to line 12, it talks about in a manner which a reasonable person would believe to be secure. This is another broad term. And I'm going to make a point in a few minutes about why I'm talking about these broad terms. But it's important to note that that's exactly what's happening here. This language can capture things outside the circumstances that I think that we all would agree might be worthy of a criminal act. But in this particular case, we need to ask ourselves, was the homeowner, in the Ethan's case, someone who reasonably believed his firearms were secure? And that's the question before us, really, in a lot of ways in this bill. But I would submit that that depends on who you ask. There was another terrible tragedy that happened in Colorado recently where a young person, 16 years old, and their friend who was 18 broke into their parents' gun cabinet in their home and took the firearms, and later there was a shooting at a school. I don't know. Part of me says, no, it's not reasonable to believe that the person in charge of the premises thought that they were leaving the guns in a negligent way. I think they probably believed they were doing it in a reasonable way. But you have to ask yourself whether it's unreasonable to think that a teenager in a wood and glass gun case is enough to stop them if their desire is to actually get into it. I think that's a subjective term. And the reason why I bring this up is because this bill goes pretty far. In Section 2, what it does is it makes someone strictly liable. And strictly liable means that there is no requirement under the law to prove that the person, in this case, the person who has the premises under their control, is actually responsible, just that the facts occurred. In fact, there's only 5 cases in our Connecticut law where the term strictly liable shows up. I asked the Office of Legislative Research to provide a document that shows those cases, and one of them is the current law. But it's a rare item where we say someone is strictly liable without really a review of the facts. I'll just read from the report. It says, under this doctrine, an injured person is not required to show that his or her loss was caused by the defendant's negligence. It is sufficient to show only that the defendant engaged in ultra-hazardous activity that caused the defendant's loss. And I can understand what ultra-hazardous activity is. I mean, storing toxic waste or something like that. But to secure a firearm in a way in your own home that you think that it's secure, I don't know if it rises to that. It goes on to say circumstances and conditions in its use which, irrespective of a lawful purpose or due care, involve a risk of probable injury to such a degree that the activity fairly can be said to be intrinsically dangerous to the person or property of others. And I know people that own firearms. They're not keeping firearms in their home because they're intrinsically dangerous to others. They keep firearms in their home typically for their own self-protection. So I just see that strict liability is quite the stretch. And that refers to the civil liability. But this bill also makes that person who is in control of the premises criminally responsible and charges them with a Class D felony, which is a significant crime. Other Class D felonies include assault in the second degree with a firearm. That's different than failing to store your firearm in a way that's sufficient to prevent a series of events that no one could have predicted from happening. Strangulation or suffocation is a Class D felony. Sexual assault in the third and fourth degree are Class D felonies. There's plenty more. I won't go on to discuss them all, but these are serious, serious, serious crimes. And of course, this case is a tragedy, but what the person who would be in charge of the premises is responsible for is a long way from the actual tragedy itself. There's also an education piece in this bill, and I know that there are some folks who consider themselves to be pro-Second Amendment advocates who are very pleased that that education requirement is in there. I'm among them. I think that that is an addition to the bill that is welcomed. But honestly, the language in here doesn't guarantee that it will ever happen or that it will be implemented. And I think calling it education is also a bit of a stretch, since it's nothing more than a guide that would advise children, because that's who it's intended for, from kindergarten to age 12, that if they see a firearm that they should report it to an adult and stay away from it, which I think is good advice that anyone could and should give to their kids. I have an amendment, Mr. President. It is LCO 8754. I ask that it be called and I be allowed to summarize.
Mr. Clerk.
LCO number 8754, Senate Schedule A.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. President. This amendment would strike the underlying bill and would provide a tax credit for a gun safe, the purchase of a gun safe. I move adoption, and I ask that when the vote is taken, it be taken by roll.
It will be so ordered. There will be roll call taken at the appropriate time. Will you remark? Senator Sampson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. This amendment, as I said, is a very simple amendment. It doesn't get rid of the existing law, but what it does do is it creates a new mechanism, which I believe achieves the exact desire of what the bill before us is supposed to do. And that is to incentivize homeowners to store their firearms safely. I don't think the underlying bill achieved that. The underlying law, and I don't think changing a few words in that underlying law is going to achieve that either, especially since it's quite clear in the bill before us and the underlying law that it doesn't really go into effect until after a tragedy occurs. This is a real thing. People will go buy gun safes if we give them a tax credit to do so. What better way to incentivize people to actually store their firearms safely than to give them a reason that they can measure and see to do so? I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, Mr. President. I think it's a common sense solution to this problem. It doesn't undo the existing law that we are only making a tiny change on the edges of, and it creates a real incentive to create more safety in the situations we're concerned about. Thank you kindly, Mr. President. So I noticed right in the beginning in Section 1, it says in any motor vehicle, and I just want to set a question for the record whether or not we are including things beyond cars and passenger trucks, but also would this bill apply to motorcycles or to campers, other types of motorized vehicles on our roads? Through Mr. President.
Thanks, Senator Sampson. Senator Winfield.
Thank you, Mr. President. And through you, Mr. President, the answer to that would be found in line 12, or actually lines 11 and 12, where C begins the answer to the question. as motor vehicles defined as the definition given in Section 14.1 of the statutes. I don't remember that off the top of my head, but I could look it up and read it to you if you would like, through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Winfield. You have the floor, Senator Sampson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. I'm familiar with Section 14-1, and I know it does include motorcycles, which I guess is just a question that I wanted to get on the record, partly because motorcycles obviously pose a different set of issues than automobiles do when you're being asked to store your firearm. I also noticed that the bill is very specific to age 21, and I would assume that's because this bill applies only to pistols and revolvers and not to long guns. Is that correct through you, Mr. President?
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Winfield, would you care to reply?
Through you, Mr. President, I believe that to be correct, but I'm not sure which section the good senator is talking about, and just so I don't say something that is not correct, I would ask if he could point out the line so that I could verify. Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Winfield. Senator Sampson.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. I'm referring to lines 5 and 6, where it says motor vehicle is unattended if no person is at least age 21 who is the owner or operator of such a motor vehicle is inside and within close proximity to the motor vehicle to prevent unauthorized access. And I noticed that we use the age 21, and I was just asking if what the purpose was of choosing 21 versus 18 or even 16. Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Winfield, you care to respond?
Through you, Mr. President, I think that has to do with ongoing conversations about responsibility and ability to think in certain situations. I will say that I wasn't involved in that portion of the drafting, so what I represent I believe to be true, but I cannot verify that at the moment. Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Winfield. Senator Sampson, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. And I noticed this bill does specifically only mention pistols and revolvers. And for the record, this does not apply to rifles. Is that correct, through Mr. President?
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Winfield.
Through you, Mr. President, for line, in answer to Senator Sampson, in line 10 and line 11, the bill specifies that it does mean, in fact, pistol and revolver as defined in sections 29 through 27 of the general statute.
Thank you, Senator Winfield. Senator Sampson, you have the floor.
Hey, thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the answers. I just wanted to get that set of circumstances on the record. So I see that it says that it is perfectly acceptable, and I'm glad that these changes were adopted in the House, that someone could store their pistol or revolver in a locked trunk, a locked safe, or a locked glove box. But do I read that correctly to assume that simply having it in a locked car is not satisfactory? Through you, Mr. President.
Senator Winfield.
Through you, Mr. President, I will answer that by expanding upon the example. I think this would be acceptable to Senator Sampson. If one were to have their pistol or revolver in the car, for instance, in the back seat, and the car is locked, that would not be acceptable. Through you, Mr. President.
Thanks. Senator Sampson, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. I'm not sure I heard exactly what you said or understood it, and I'm very sorry for that. Just to reiterate, the question is, I understand locked safe, locked glove box, locked trunk, but if the vehicle itself is not locked and it's in the locked glove box or not in the locked glove box, what are the circumstances? Does the car require to be locked too? Or if the car is not locked, but the glove box is? Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Winfield.
Through you, Mr. President, I do think that that's a slightly different question than I perceived, but I will say that what this bill talks about is, as Senator Sampson pointed out, the trunk being locked, the box being locked, and those things. And so I would suggest that the reading of the bill that I have is that those parts of the vehicle, if they're considered parts of the vehicle, must be locked. Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Winfield. Senator Sampson, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think that's all the questions I have. I'll let the gentleman sit down. This just speaks to just the overall confusion I have with this bill, I think it's got a good intent. We're trying to prevent firearms falling into the hands of criminals by them being stolen out of parked vehicles. I think that makes a lot of sense. There are a number of ways we can approach that, and I'm just not certain that this bill gets to that, because in some ways I think we're preventing the owner of the vehicle from making their own decisions about the proper way to store their firearm in a way that's best to secure it and to make sure it's not stolen by setting these parameters. I'm also curious to understand why we would go through the trouble of making this requirement for pistols and revolvers but leave rifles alone. So presumably under this language, you can store your rifle out in the open in your vehicle, and that's not a crime. But yet, if you lock your car and the gun is in the glove box, that is a crime. And that just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I wonder also about what happens when someone steals a car. Now, clearly that's a crime on its own, but is there any liability for the person who owned the car to begin with for the way they stored the firearm at that time? And in our laws in Connecticut, it is a requirement that you must report a stolen firearm. So if someone steals a firearm from a vehicle and that person goes to report it, could they find themselves in trouble? In fact, I'll ask that question of the proponent of the bill. Could you ultimately put yourself at risk of being guilty, I believe, of a Class A misdemeanor for reporting the theft of your firearm from your vehicle through you, Mr. President?
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Winfield.
Through you, Mr. President, I guess I would have to ask for more details on the situation. I'm not sure what the question is asking. Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Winfield. Senator Sampson, could you clarify the question?
Certainly. I came up with one scenario, which I will repeat, which is someone owns a vehicle, the car is locked, they have a handgun that is in the glove box, but the glove box is not locked. I believe that would make them liable under this bill for a Class A misdemeanor in the first offense. If someone were to steal that firearm under those circumstances and that person reported it, would they be subject to prosecution? Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Winfield.
Through you, Mr. President, I will say that if the individual reporting should have secured the firearm under the provisions of this bill should it become law, and they did not, and they reported it, it is within the realm of possibility that there is a prosecution. Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Winfield. Senator Sampson, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. So that's interesting. I almost think that it might have been a worthwhile endeavor to provide some sort of immunity if the person reports the stolen firearm, since our ultimate goal is to keep that firearm off the streets in its entirety. I guess that's my main issue with this bill, is it covers some of the things. I would much rather see legislation that maybe created a crime for someone leaving their firearm exposed on the passenger seat of the car, creating an attractive nuisance for someone to create a crime. But I can see people who, again, trying to do the right thing, getting caught up and becoming responsible when they were not, intending to commit a crime. I also I have a question about line 6. It says, for the purpose of this section, a motor vehicle is unattended if no person who is at least 21 years of age is within close enough proximity. So if someone stops at a gas station or a Dunkin' Donuts, say, and they leave their car for the very few minutes to run into the store, would that qualify as leaving the vehicle unattended and therefore create liability under this bill if it becomes law? Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Senator Winfield.
Through you, Mr. President, I think it depends on the circumstances of that particular situation. Simply leaving the vehicle, of course, does not. I think it depends upon whether or not the individual is able to prevent that unauthorized access, and that is a matter of the circumstances on the ground as we look at that individual circumstance. I will say this, while I did answer the previous question, the further question was not asked about, so what happens if there's the possibility of a charge being brought? And if you look at lines 53, going forward down to section 2 there, which is on line 58, the court can order a suspension of the prosecution if that individual reported the circumstances or the facts that report the crime that the good senator was asking about. Through you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Winfield. Senator Sampson, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thanks again to the gentleman for the answers to his questions. And this time I'm not going to ask any more questions. I do, however, Mr. President, have a number of amendments. The very first one I'd like to offer is LCO 8744. I asked the clerk call it, and then I'll be allowed to summarize.
Senate will stand at ease for just a moment. Mr. Clerk, call the amendment, please.
LCO number 8744, Senate Schedule A.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. This is a very straightforward amendment. It would change in Section 1 the crime of stealing a firearm from a Class C to a Class B felony, and in effect increasing the penalty. Through you, Mr. President. Oh, actually, I'm sorry, I got sidetracked. I move adoption, and I would ask that when the vote is taken, it be taken by roll.
Thank you. The amendment has been moved, and a roll call will be ordered at the appropriate time at the end of debate. Will you remark further on the amendment? Senator Sampson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. And sorry, I've got a lot of papers in front of me. I'm trying to keep my documents straight. The intention of this bill, I think, is quite clear, and that is to prevent firearms from falling into the hands of criminals. And it does that in the bill before us by punishing the owner of the firearm if they are somehow lax in the way they secure it, which is certainly a worthwhile approach if done correctly. This change that I have here, I think, is a much more direct approach, which it makes a much more significant penalty in the case of someone who would steal that firearm by increasing that from a Class C to a Class B felony. And I encourage my colleagues to support it. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. As we have been discussing, the goal of this bill is to encourage folks to store their firearms in a safe and secure manner to prevent the theft and the potential for these firearms to end up on our streets and potentially involved in crime, something that I am very, very concerned about. And I know that we're going to do another bill today, and I plan to speak at length about that subject in particular. There was another inconsistency that I mentioned with the bill that's before us that is something that came up during the public hearing and also once the bill passed in the House of Representatives. And several folks approached me and said that we really should address this concern. And that is a situation where someone might be on their way to the gun range to practice because they're involved in target shooting, or they're going hunting, or they're doing something like this. And the bill is very specific about saying that a motor vehicle is unattended if the owner or operator or passenger is not within close enough proximity to prevent unauthorized access. And You know, one of the issues with this bill is that we live in a world where there's a great many places that you cannot carry your firearm. The post office, a lot of government buildings, even some movie theaters. So it presents a problem for folks who do want to follow their Second Amendment right to carry a firearm on their person. They would have to take that firearm off and leave it in their vehicle to enter that place. And this is how this issue comes about. And we heard a lot of testimony about concerns about folks having to get out of their car and being exposed while they're putting the firearm in the trunk. And more people are going to be aware that these firearms are out there, potentially creating a situation where a criminal might witness them do it and start the process of a crime, something we want to avoid. One of the very similar situations that was brought up, though, is folks that might simply just want to get out of their vehicle once they stop for gas, or they stop to get a coffee, something like that. And I'm afraid that the language in the bill would potentially put them at risk, because they simply, while doing their due diligence and securing the firearm in the car, they go into the gas station and then come back. So I have a very simple amendment to resolve this issue, Madam President. It is LCO 8740. I'd ask that you have the clerk call this amendment.